And camera is rolling. We'll just start with your name and information first.
Go ahead, give your name.
Oh, my name is Alvin C. Gantz, Jr.
Okay.
How did you, your family, come to Lancaster? Were they born here? Did they move here?
My family was born here. I was born here, my immediate family was born here, and most of my relatives were either born here or in Gap or in Mannheim or Mount Joy.
Where did you live growing up?
Growing up, I lived at about 3 places. First house was 503 North Street. Second house was 443 South Christian Street. And my last house that I lived in as a child, as a kid growing up, was in 443 South Christian Street.
You want to tell me who your neighbors were? You told by name who you lived next door, who were up the street.
My neighbor at
My
5...
apologies. I'm seeing a corn rolling again.
Your neighbors.
My neighbors while I lived in the 7th Ward, I remember Earl Warfel, who was a neighbor at 443 South Christian Street. I remember a Reverend Ray was a neighbor when I was very young on 503 North Street. But I forget my neighbors on 443. I forget what their name was.
All your neighbors.
Oh, well, there was the Bootses, there was across the street, there was Mr. Specs, Henry Esters, there was, down the street, there was, the Waterses, Mr. Pete Waters and the family, the Browns, I forget his name, his real name, but Waterboy we called him. He was, he raised, it hangs with Chucky knows. Bruce. Raised Bruce Womack. They're the ones I remember. I don't remember too many others on the street.
Who were your running buddies? Who were your friends? Who were the guys you hung around with?
Oh, the guys that I ran around with when I was young was Dickie Sims, Richard Sims, Johnny Hill, Charlie Cater, Donald Shelton, Jackie Shelton, Bobby Anderson, Herman Sims, Sonny Cooper, Eugene Boyce, Tony Clark, and a few more. Yeah.
Start with the schools that you attended. Start with elementary school and then go straight up through.
The first school I attended, elementary school, was Adam Reichert on Strawberry Street. The next school was George Washington. Then junior high was Edwin Hand. And high school was J.P. McCaskey.
And what church did you attend?
My church was Bethel AME on Strawberry Street, Strawberry and North Street.
I apologize. So if we could just start from the beginning again. I'll have your name,
Okay.
so we're fine. We'll just start if Jared just asks the first question.
All right, first question is, how did your family come to Lancaster? What towns were they from? Where did they come from? How long have they been here?
All right, my family was born here. I was born here. Brothers and sisters were born here. And my mother and father were born here. And all my grandparents were either born here or around southern Lancaster County, Mannheim, or Mount Joy.
Where did you live growing up in Lancaster? Give me the addresses, the streets you lived.
Growing up in Lancaster, I lived at probably 3 places I can remember. First was 503 North Street, 443 South Christian Street and 444 South Christian Street. Those are the houses that I remember growing up as a kid.
Just keep going. Go ahead.
I'll wait for it.
Just the backup mic. Okay.
Who were your neighbors where you lived on?
My next door neighbors that I recall are right next to me at 444 was Earl Warfel. My very next door neighbor at 443, or it was 444, was the Yules. That's Mr. Yule and his whole family, including Barney Yule. Down the streets were the Mr. Henry Esters, the Waterses, Mr. Pete Waters, the Browns, and that's all I can remember, their names anyway. I remember faces, I can't remember their names.
Who were your running buddies? Who were your friends? Who'd you run around with?
All my running buddies when I grew up in the gang, my generation was, the guys that I ran around with were Richard Sims, John Hill, Bobby Anderson, Harold Jordan, Herman Sims, Sonny Cooper, Donald Shelton, Jackie Shelton, Charlie Cater, Paul Cater, just to name a few that I can remember. Good.
Start with your elementary school and give me the schools you went to all the way up through high school.
The schools that I attended in Lancaster were, my first school was at Adam Reichert on Strawberry Street. The second school was George Washington on Ann Street, Edward Hand on Ann, and J.P. McCaskey High School.
And sir, just pull your microphone up just a little bit. It looks like you pulled down on the cord just so it's not scrunched. There you go. Just perfect.
And what church did you and your family attend?
My church affiliation is Bethel AME Church.
What businesses or stores were around you? That's not just on North Street, but on the whole, North Street, Duke Street, but Howard Avenue, wherever.
In the 7th Ward, there was so many stores it wasn't funny. Around me, there was Bill Klavonsky on North Street, what we called the Delta, or the Sanitary Market on Duke Street, Herman's on Duke Street, Slotkins on Locust and Duke, Blum's drugstore on Chester Street, the Delicatessen on Chester Street, Green Grocery on Green Street, who else? Sub Shop on corner of Howard Avenue, just to name a few. Almost on every corner there was a store.
And try to talk directly to Jerry as much as possible just so it looks more like a conversation.
What were the activities that you were involved in school and after school each day? What kind of stuff did you do?
Well, the activities that I had in school was after school. In grade school was just coming home and playing outside and running around the streets with the guys. By the time I got to junior high school, my activities after school usually were in sports, either football practice or basketball practice. And by that time, we started playing baseball and everything in the summer. In the wintertime, it would be just like going to Christmas Attics, going to the center and playing basketball and, having just socializing crafts and all that there on the thing.
What did you do in the summer months when school was out?
When school was out in the summer months, most of the time me and the guys I mentioned as my friends would either be going out, going down to the creek, swimming, going fishing, or going camping at night, or playing baseball or something. But every day we were doing something like that. We would just leave home and just wander all over the city of Lancaster.
And I know from knowing you that you went scouting, and you want to tell about your scout leader and who was in the scout troop and where you went camping to.
Oh, sure. That was part of my activities in the evenings. Even when I was young, my mom was a den mother when I was a Cub Scout. So we did things in the wintertime mostly, and in the summer doing mostly scouting things, like camping and all that there. When I was a Boy Scout, my scout leader was Nelson Polite. And in the summer, the same things we did was camporees, camping. We camped a lot at the old Kiwanis. We would camp just out with our own tents and stuff down by the streams and all that. Or we would go to Camp Chickwatown, which was that time down in southern Lancaster County, around the Susquehanna River. We went there all the time. But these were some of the main things we did. And by that time also, I was heavily involved in the Drum and Bugle Corps, sponsored by Conestoga Lodge of Elks. I was one of the original members of it, and that took up a lot of our time also in the evenings, especially in the summertime.
Where did you go for recreation? What local parks? You said Kiwanis, but talk about a little bit more about Crispus Attucks and the parks that you went to. You said this one. Talk about the Pogie. Talk about that freely.
The recreation when I was young was the park. One of the men was Williamson's Park, where we hung at. That's where we went not only for ourselves, but the family went there a lot for picnics. But we also took picnics when I was young, we also took picnics just going out to a meadow. We would go down behind the county home by the creek, and we would just go on the other side of the creek and just have a picnic. We just put down blankets and bring food and all and have a picnic. And also we swam there. And we also swam down on the Conestoga by the county park, which is close to where that club is down there now. What's the name of that club? Oh, I forget, but it's down the bottom of Strawberry Street. We also swam down there. But that was mainly the time. The Crispus Attucks Center, almost all of my activities there were crafts. We would build modern airplanes and do stuff, and sports. Basketball mainly at Crispus Attucks, where we went through all the time on the thing.
You want to go ahead and talk about Crispus Attucks? I know you knew who the leader was, Miss Payne, and the other people, Mr. Tarver.
Now Miss Payne, she was the director for many years. I think she was an effective director, a little opinionated at times, but effective. Mr. Tarver, on the other hand, who was sort of like the director, I would call, he was a great man. He was a role model that I liked. In fact, most of us were very hurt when he took and left Lancaster to go to Chicago. But he was really a role model, and he was everything. He had us interested in and participating in PAL. You know what that is? Police Athletic League. That was a big sponsor of kids' activities and everything at the time. But he's something I really remember, the darn thing.
Where did you work as a teenager?
As a teenager, I worked at a gas station on North and Duke Street, an Atlantic gas station, most of my working time as a teenager. The other times I worked a little while for Bogar Lumber Company, construction. In fact, I helped build a wing at George Washington School. And I also worked at a shoe shine parlor uptown called Gus's. I forget the last name. It was about right on the same side of the street around the Hamilton Theater, if you remember where that was, on the darn thing. But mainly my main work was at the Atlantic gas station on North and Duke Streets. In fact, me and Harold Jordan worked there together.
What difficulties did you have in obtaining employment when you became an adult, if any? Did you have any problem? You want to tell that whole story about you became an adult, got a job. How did that happen?
When I became an adult, I went to the military first. When I came out of the military, I applied for a job at RCA, a salary job, and I got it. In other words, I didn't have no problem getting any jobs when I got it.
You want to tell us about that job?
No, just a technician's job working in television. At that time, RCA was at the forefront of color television. We were at the forefront of closed circuit television. One of the high points of my working career was I helped test, fabricate, and make the first tubes that took the pictures of the moon, and the first tubes that were in our now present weather system in space today.
You want to talk a little bit about RCA, the makeup of the company, what year you started there, how many African Americans worked there, that whole story?
RCA, which was my employer, when I got a job there, I believe I was only the second African American on salary. They had maybe 10 women who worked in the production, and I believe we had at the most 2 African American men who were salaried. And at that time, RCA employed almost 5,000 people in Lancaster. Now, as the years went by, this changed drastically. They got far more minorities started working for RCA. Far more women, and they started getting in far more, quite a bit more salaried African Americans and Puerto Ricans, but not many, also, and women in those kind of positions, salaried and otherwise. And by the time I spent 32 years with RCA, and by the time I left RCA, by the time RCA was bought by GE, I think we were well represented.
Now I know you got your training in the Air Force. I want to talk about what training you got in the Air Force and how that led to what you did at RCA.
Well, when I volunteered for the Air Force, I enlisted in 1952, and when you go into the military, they give you aptitude tests, and my test pointed I should go to an electronics school. So my first school I went to was Electronic Fundamentals in Denver, Colorado, and from Denver, Colorado, I went to armament school, and from Denver, an advanced armament school at Denver, and then later on in Los Angeles at Hughes Aircraft Company for what is called armament fire control. Now that fire control don't mean fireman, that meant fire control for weapons. And it was radar and computer guided missiles. And that background gave me the electronic background I needed when I got out of service to get my job at RCA as electronic technician.
What were some of the major news stories that impacted your life while living in the 7th Ward? As things happened, as wars developed, as presidents were elected. I know you have to think about that for a second, but what were the major news stories that affected your life and the community?
The major news stories of my time that may have affected my life, I don't know if they would have affected my life, but they were notable to me. I think the era of Martin Luther King Jr. would have been the most. And by the way, I saw him in person when he came to speak at Franklin and Marshall. I was in the audience, and he spoke there. The devastating things that happened when he was murdered, that happened in Lancaster, I was in a part of. But I think the most notable things from a standpoint of our country was we witnessed the first landing on the moon, the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt, I remember clearly. The end of World War II, which was momentous to me, I remember clearly. All of the civil rights turmoil and commotion that went on, I remember clearly. I participated in the civil rights demonstrations here in Lancaster. There are just a few.
Did you demonstrate down at Rocky Springs and at the stores downtown?
Yes.
Go ahead and talk about that.
Well, I demonstrated them. These demonstrations, I just felt it was a part that I had to be part of. So we just demonstrated. We took abuse, verbal abuse from people at times, but not much, to tell you the truth. I don't know whether they ever helped because the guy closed Rocky Springs. We demonstrated at the one out near Donnelly. What was that called? There's a pool out there we demonstrated.
He'll cut me out. It's Brookside.
Brookside, yeah. It was.
You need to say it in the whole sentence.
I said one of the pools we demonstrated was Brookside out there. We demonstrated Maple Grove. None of those pools ever integrated except for one, and that was Brookside, who I think admitted a teacher from here. I forget his name. But they admitted him as one member, and that's about it. Other than that, none more.
You told me a story about a guy over in New York that let blacks come over to his pool over in New York. Was he a councilman or something? Or was it?
Oh,
you need to start the whole story over.
At that time, we weren't allowed. By that, African Americans, blacks, were not allowed in any pool in Lancaster County. But one of the things I forgot to tell you is one of the momentous things that I think that happened in Lancaster while I was here was when we elected Tom Monahan as mayor. When we elected a man named Tom Monahan as mayor, things started to change. He hired a public safety director named Danny Templeton. And Danny Templeton was from York, and he had a swimming pool in York. And he took it upon himself to open up his swimming pool in New York that African Americans could go swim in. So if you get over to York, you could go swimming in his pool on it. But and he worked, and he was hired by Tom Monahan. Tom Monahan also appointed myself, and Charles Sims to the Lancaster Housing Authority, in which I eventually became the chairman of Lancaster Housing Authority, and was instrumental in getting Farnham apartments built under my administration, and Chucky's administration on there, and we administrated and managed Duke Towers for years, and we were the first, and under my administration, we introduced scattered site housing in Lancaster.
Who were some of the leaders, role models in the community when you were a teenager and when you were an adult? You can start with Chris Passac, you can go to the high school, you can go any people who influenced your life that you thought were role models.
I was influenced by some people, but I'm not so much a influencee. I don't follow too easy. So I would say that when I was a real young kid, my role models would have been Mr. George Proctor, who was the director of our drum and bugle corps, Mr. Nelson Polite, who was one of the directors of our in the Drum and Bugle Corps. Of course, my dad. My dad is the one I really is my role model. I try to be like my dad as much as I could on the thing. And Mr. Reuben Hardcastle, Mr. Tarver. I don't have too many other role models. Excuse me.
Well, you're saying that you led people yourself. Talk about that.
Oh no, I would just.
Well,
I was not I didn't mean that way. I just ain't don't follow too easy for people. Tell me or go what they do, you know. But I've been in leadership positions myself. I've been an elk all my life, just about, and I at least attained the status of elected the president of the whole state of Pennsylvania for the Elks organization, which I held for 12 years. And I was a district deputy who had supervisory jobs over 8 lodges in eastern Pennsylvania, and I did that for 20 years as it. So I did my part on that too, but that's about all.
You mentioned earlier about your dealings in the civil rights movement, and I know as a kid they had the meetings when we were having problems in the high school and those street problems. You were one of those people that were running those meetings, so you want to talk about that for a little bit?
I didn't have much to do with the high school. I don't remember having much to do with the high school.
When we walked out of school, you guys had meetings upstairs in the Elks and over at Crispus Attucks, and you were one of those people. That's what I'm talking about.
No,
You're calming the people down, and then that led off into the street. That time is what I'm talking about.
Well, that was a time when it was a very high emotional time, and things were going to happen, and we didn't want them to happen. Because you got to remember, when I was going to McCaskey High School and all those Lancaster schools, we were afforded the best education that was available in the county of Lancaster, bar none. There was no school that ever compared with the schools in Lancaster City. There weren't any and none in the county. So this turnabout had far-reaching consequences with me because I couldn't understand it when they started walking out of the school and coming out and everything. And all we were trying to do was just get to the bottom of what was going on. So we figured out what was causing this problem on the whole thing. That's all I know about.
What did you think and feel about living in the 7th Ward? Talk about, encapsulate your experience as a child growing up in the 7th Ward.
Growing up in the 7th Ward, and by the way, I still live in the 7th Ward, right out here. Growing up in the 7th Ward to me, in my time, was great as a child and as a kid growing up. Mainly because we didn't know any better about living anywhere else, but because of the closeness of it. Everyone knew everybody. You may not believe this, but no one locked their doors when I was growing up. In the summertime, there was screen doors on the store, and that was it. You just didn't lock your door. In the night, you would sit out in the summer in the heat, and you'd sit out on the porch, and you would talk. You would talk across the street, and you would talk to everybody. There was no problem. Sure, there was a little altercation every now and then, but that happened in every community. But in the 7th Ward, it was just one big family, I thought. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone looked out for everybody, mostly, and that's the way I liked it. And I liked it that way until I went to when I joined the military, I started seeing other parts of the country and how other people lived. For instance, when I first got to Denver, Colorado, I went to a movie that showed black movies. I never heard of no thing like that in Lancaster. Black cowboys, good guys, bad guys, guys with white hats, and I'm sitting there looking at this and I couldn't believe that. They had black drive-ins where you could go eat, black bars, black nightclubs. None of that in Lancaster. They had all this in Denver, and I said, we never had nothing. We had some bars here in Lancaster, but nothing like that. And then I started getting my eyes open and living in other places, living in better places with better facilities and all that. There is when, by the time I got to be an adult, I just wanted more than just living in the living in the Seventh Ward.
Describe the Seventh Ward community during this time frame. I'm talking about this housing stock, the businesses, the churches. Describe what it looked like and what kind of community.
Now, the first thing you got to realize when you describe the Seventh Ward is the Seventh Ward when I was young was predominantly white. That's the first thing you got to realize. It was at least 60% to 30 to 40 for African Americans. Okay, so in every block where you live, there was the majority. There were white people living. Okay, the housing stock I thought was adequate. I only know of one house that didn't have electric, and that was I don't want to say. I only know of one house that didn't have an electric. Every other house had water, electric, heat, and everything else. Comfortable, cozy, and little row houses that everyone lived in. There was nothing. There was maybe one section of town that would be a couple sections that would run down. That would be Barney Google Road and Shantytown. Out beyond back of Edward Hand. But other than that, I thought everything was just rosy.
Identify your perception of good and bad sections of the neighborhood. Well, you just said it, so we don't even.
Yeah.
What doctors and dentists and professional people did you go to? Did you aware of that were there in the Seventh Ward? You start from the beginning.
I was only aware of. I'm trying to remember Dr. Starrett. He was a dentist. Wasn't he? No, he was a doctor. The dentist was Dr. I forget their name. Doctor.
Let me stick on it. Go cut them out. And then there was Dr. Travis. There was Dr. Robinson. There was Dr. Copper. And you said Dr. Starrett. So go ahead and start all over again.
Like I said, the professional people that I know in the Seventh Ward was, for me as a child, was Dr. Starrett, Dr. Copper, Dr. Travis, Dr. Robinson, and the only other people I would call professional may be policemen. I know three. When I was young, was Officer Duncan, Buzzy Brown, Leonard Wilson, and the very first black officer before all of them was what was his name?
Lavender.
Earl Lavender.
Well, you got to say that in the whole sentence.
The doctor I know was Earl Lavender.
Go ahead and say that in the whole sentence, the very first.
The first ones I know probably was you talk about the professionals was Dr. Travis.
No, just talk about the policeman.
Oh,
you got everybody else. Just talk about Earl Lavender. And talk about what kind of man he was.
No, I didn't know that much about. I was a kid. I didn't know.
You told me before you knew all the cops that lived in the Seventh Ward. They weren't all black, but you knew all of them that lived on Christian Street and all the rest of that. Go ahead and talk about that.
The only ones that I know a lot about, that I know the ones that I know are the black ones was Buzzy Brown, Duncan, Earl Lavender, Leonard Wilson. I knew. The only one that I knew that had personal dealings with all the time because he was a truant officer was Dave, lived on Dolphin Street.
Got me now.
Well, no, wait a minute.
Was it Eliner? I don't
No,
know.
Bobby, I went to school with his nephew, Bobby, the pitcher. Eliner was one, but the pitcher.
Well, that's not
I've
important,
got him,
'cause
yeah.
I don't know, I can't
Yeah.
help you with that, I don't know who it is. What hospitals were available to you?
Now-
And tell us about, because people don't know that, people that will be watching this don't realize that people were born at home and didn't go to a hospital for everything. So what hospitals were available to you? How many of your family were born in the hospital and how many weren't?
Oh, in the city of Lancaster, we had three hospitals: St. Joseph's, General, and the Osteopathic Hospital were the three. Now, in those days, there was no insurance. So if you didn't have the money, they had clinic days. There were certain days of the week you could go and get free health care on certain days of the week for nothing. But most people didn't run to the hospitals and the doctor like they do now. In fact, usually when they went to the hospital, there was something serious with them. They didn't go. There was a lot of, most of the women who had babies who had them at home. In my family, all of my brothers and sisters were born in the hospital except my brother, Buddy Cassius, who was born at home rather than go to the hospital. And this was late, and I think Dr. Stret delivered him on the thing. But those were the three hospitals, and those were the conditions on it.
What nightclubs, dance halls were available at this time? You would go up and down Duke Street, start at Duke and start at Mastro's and go the whole way down. And where you went and where other people went.
When you're dealing with the nightlife in Lancaster, it was mainly bars. The bars were, again, in Lancaster, about one on every corner. If you would go down Duke Street, if you would start at the corner of Vine, you would have Maestro's, then you go down to Howard Avenue and you would have Len's, and then you would go down and then you would have Hawley's, and then you would have the Elks, and then you go down further down and you would have Joe Capps, the old Joe Capps that was on Rockland Street in Chesapeake. If you went up on Chester Street, right a block up from Duke Street, you had Howler's Bar, and then you had clubs like the Fin and Feather that was on Howard Avenue and Rockland Street. But a lot of these places, African Americans weren't welcome, or only certain African Americans were welcome. They had a policy. I know at the original Caps, most African Americans couldn't go in there, but they had some favorites that they would let come in, and they happened to be more or less what I guess you would consider the middle class of African Americans, something they let in. Other than that, you weren't allowed to go into those places. But most of them were. The only nightclub that I knew of, even when I was young, if you want to call it a nightclub, was the Village, which was at the old bus station. That would be about like back at the old Brunswick now, and a nightclub called the Coronet, which was like across the street from the Hamilton Theater, there on Queen Street. They're the only nightclubs that I think were even in Lancaster. I think. That's it.
You didn't mention Sturgis's.
I told.
No, you didn't say it. So I'll let you start all over with go ahead and say a whole sentence about Sturgis, who he was, how you knew him, where he came from.
Oh, when we're talking about the clubs, one club that was a main club for African Americans and a lot of white people who would come down to that club was John Sturgis's, which was on Duke Street, right next door. It was on Duke, almost on the corner of North and Duke. John Sturgis was a Harrisburg. I think he was a retired police officer. I don't know whether retired or not, but he was a policeman from Harrisburg who came to Lancaster and set up a business. He was very influential. Nice man. I liked John. He was a friend of mine. I went hunting with him because I used to like to hunt a lot, and we would go hunting with him a lot. But his bar or club, because he had entertainment on the weeks, he would have bands and entertainment on the weekends, drew a lot of people from all over Lancaster, to tell you the truth. It would come down to it. And you could go there and have a really good time. I didn't start going into there till when I got out of service and started going into the club. I didn't hang in there much at first. Then I did hang in there more or less when I got older.
Somebody else that was interviewed talked about hunting and hunting bear. So you want to tell your experience in starting up in Mount Joy and your whole life of hunting and what you do now?
Well, Lancaster County in Pennsylvania is a hunting state. It's a hunter state. And back when I was young, it was even more so a hunter state. We hunted everything. I didn't, but people in all over the state and Lancaster County hunted state. In Lancaster County, we had one of the premier pheasant and small game hunting areas in the country. So we used to hunt every year, and it was like a holiday. Schools would close, especially county schools. And everyone on opening day would go hunting on the darn thing. And I hunted, and I still do hunt on the darn thing. I never hunted bear, because I never thought of bear as food. But a lot of people hunted. I hunt deer, but I never hunted bear on the darn thing. But I've seen them, but I've never hunted them.
If you say the darn thing one more time, she's going to slap you. What did you like the least about living in the 7th Ward, and why? And I know it's hard for you to think about for a second. What was there any barrier, things that you could not do in the 7th Ward? Because you lived there, because of the color of your skin, is there anything that you did not like about, was it a confinement for you?
The 7th Ward was never a confinement to me. It just, I guess about the worst thing about living in the 7th Ward to me was there's not enough parking places for my car. Every time, I almost got in more fights about parking spaces, especially when it snowed and you dug out a parking space, or when you come home from the store and you couldn't park in front of your house and had to unload your groceries and all. That bothered me more than anything. Other than that, I just never had anything hard to say about 7th Ward.
Right. And now I'm going to ask you about the best parts of living in the 7th Ward. Your friends, your family, what you did in good times. Your Christmas, you guys go around Christmas into everybody's house. Talk about the good things.
Yeah, and one's life in the 7th Ward, like I said in the beginning, was very close. So what we did, I think the memorable things all the time to me as a kid was, I always felt safe in the 7th Ward. Always was safe. I could go around everywhere. Someone knew you. I had relatives living almost in every block or every 2 blocks. We had friends all around, knew the family and everything. And it was just something that we did. On Christmases, we would all just get together and start going from Christmas Eve, going from house to house, singing carols, going inside, having some libation, having some food, and going for another house. I remember once in 1965, we had one of the biggest snowstorms ever. It closed the whole city. There was no traffic, and it was snow all over the place, and this was quiet, and the lights in the house and the trees were burning, and everyone was just out going along, walking all over the place, just going from house to house, singing Christmas carols, and having something to eat and having something to drink, and going through them out there. And so I remember that to this day, and everything going all the time I think about it. And this was something we did every year. And it's a tradition now we still kind of keep going.
I'm going to just jump back here 1 second. You told me a story about Milton Hershey. You remember the candy factory. You remember the beer brewery up on Chester Street. And you remember Milton Hershey having a candy store down on Church Street. You want to tell something about them old places like the beer breweries and the candy factory?
If one knows about, in Lancaster, it's a very historic place. Very historic. If one knows what's going on about Milton Hershey, they would know that Milton Hershey's candy store, and I believe the cabin, the building is still there on the bottom of Church Street, is where he had a candy store on the darn thing. He went in and out of business so many times. He also had if you know his life, he had let's say, a favorite aunt who lived on Queen Street who kept bankrolling him every time he would need something from the time. And as a matter of history, everyone knows he went to Denver and opened the candy store. And then when he found out the secret to caramel, how he did it. But when he found out the secret of making the caramel from overseas, he built that factory there where Church Towers is now. That's the caramel factory he built, and I remember the whole time, and when it was operating, and when its last days, when it caught fire, and when he finally tore it down, that's where he made his money. That's where he got rich at, to be able to go up and buy the land in Derry Township in Harrisburg to build his Hershey factory. And the breweries in Lancaster, the breweries in Lancaster that I remember operating was the one that would entail that whole area from Rockland Street to Lime Street to Locust Street to Chester Street was a brewery. And they made beer. I forget it was. I don't remember the brand now. It could have been Whacker. I think it was Whacker or something. And you could go in there. I remember my dad used to take me as a kid. He used to go when he used to get a beer. He used to go in there. It was always wet and cool. You could go in there and he'd get beer and sit there at the table in there. And there was no air conditioning hardly then. So in the summertime, they'd go up there and sit and drink beer in there and give me a taste, and everything would be good on the darn thing. And I also remember the brewery out on Walnut Street, right off to the right. There's an AA Electric there or something right now there. And that brewery, I don't forget its name, may have been Springer, I'm not sure. But there was a brewery there on the darn thing. They're all going now.
All coming back now.
They're all going, there's a big one.
Just to wrap this up, you want to talk about, how fortunate you were to live in the 7th Ward at that time and what it did for you and what it did for your family. Just give us a closing statement.
I think if I was to take, in retrospect, look back at it, I think that from the time I was born until now and living in the 7th Ward, it kind of molds you into, first of all, like I said, I never had no traumatic or terrible moments as a kid. Things that, went through other African Americans in other parts of the country and all that there, this never happened to me or us around here. Maybe it's because of the religious influence of the area or something, but that just never happened. If I got in a fight with someone who was white, I just got in a fight with him. No one come around to hang me or nothing. I beat him up, he just got beat up. He beat me up, he just got beat up. You know what I mean? It was something that went on like that. And growing up like that and going to school, but I think the biggest thing about here is the education. I think my generation got the best public education that we could ever get. And I know people since then have got it, just don't get it no more. We had a good education, if we took it, if we availed ourselves of it. It was good. It was there. All integrated classes. I was always a minority in my classes. There were three or four of us in there, even in Adam Reichert. But we always had a good education. I think that's what stood me. And I always just did like to learn something new. And I think that's what stood me in good stead all my life so far.
Sure.
Good.
If you're happy?
Good. I'm good.
That's good.